Section 5 of Psychology of the Unconscious by Carl Jung. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5, Chapter 1, Part 2. One might raise the objection that the mythological inclinations of children are implanted by education. The objection is futile. Has humanity at all ever broken loose from the myths? Every man has eyes and all his senses to perceive that the world is dead, cold, and unending, and he has never yet seen a god, nor brought to light the existence of such from empirical necessity. On the contrary, there was need of a fantastic, indestructible optimism, and one far removed from all sense of reality, in order, for example, to discover in the shameful death of Christ really the highest salvation and the redemption of the world. Thus one can indeed withhold from a child the substance of earlier myths, but not take from him the need for mythology. One can say that should it happen that all traditions in the world were cut off with a single blow, then with the succeeding generation the whole mythology and history of religion would start over again. Only a few individuals succeed in throwing off mythology in a time of a certain intellectual supremacy. The mass never frees itself. Explanations are of no avail. They merely destroy a transitory form of manifestation, but not the creating impulse. Let us again take up our earlier train of thought. We spoke of the ontogenetic re-echo of the phylogenetic psychology among children. We saw that fantastic thinking is a characteristic of antiquity, of the child, and of the lower races. But now we know also that our modern and adult man is given over in large part to this same fantastic thinking, which enters as soon as the directed thinking ceases. A lessening of the interest, a slight fatigue, is sufficient to put an end to the directed thinking, the exact psychological adaptation to the real world, and to replace it with fantasies. We digress from the theme and give way to our own trains of thought. If the slackening of the attention increases, then we lose by degrees the consciousness of the present, and the fantasy enters into possession of the field. Here the important question obtrudes itself: how are fantasies created? From the poets we learn much about it, from science we learn little. The psychoanalytic method presented to science by Freud shed light upon this for the first time. It showed us that there are typical cycles. The stutterer imagines he is a great orator. The truth of this Demosthenes, thanks to his energy, has proven. The poor man imagines himself to be a millionaire, the child an adult. The conquered fight out victorious battles with the conqueror. The unfit torments or delights himself with ambitious plans. We imagine that which we lack. The interesting question of the why of all this we must here leave unanswered, while we return to the historic problem: from what source do the fantasies draw their materials? We chose as an example a typical fantasy of puberty. A child in that stage, before whom the whole frightening uncertainty of the future fate opens, puts back the uncertainty into the past through his fantasy, and says, if only I were not the child of my ordinary parents, but the child of a rich and fashionable count, and had been merely passed over to my parents, then some day a golden coach would come, and the count would take his child back with him to his wonderful castle. And so it goes on, as in Grimm's fairy tales, which the mother tells to her children. With a normal child it stops with the fugitive, quickly passing idea, which is soon covered over and forgotten. However, at one time, and that was in the ancient world of culture, the fantasy was an openly acknowledged institution. The heroes, I recall Romulus and Remus, Semiramis, Moses, and many others, have been separated from their real parents. Others are directly sons of gods, and the noble races derive their family trees from heroes and gods. As one sees by this example, the fantasy of modern humanity is nothing but a re-echo of an old folk belief, which was very widespread originally. The ambitious fantasy chooses, among others, a form which is classic and which once had a true meaning. The same thing holds good in regard to the sexual fantasy. In the preamble we have spoken of dreams of sexual assault, the robber who breaks into the house and commits a dangerous act. That, too, is a mythological theme, and in the prehistoric era was certainly a reality, too. Wholly apart from the fact that the capture of women was something general in the lawless prehistoric times, it was also a subject of mythology in cultivated epochs. I recall the capture of Proserpina, Deianira, Europa, the Sabine women, etc. We must not forget that even today marriage customs exist in various regions which recall the ancient custom of marriage by capture. The symbolism of the instrument of coitus was an inexhaustible material for ancient fantasy. It furnished a widespread cult that was designated phallic, the object of reverence of which was the phallus. The companion of Dionysus was Thales, a personification of the phallus proceeding from the phallic Herme of Dionysus. The phallic symbols were countless. Among the Sabines the custom existed for the bridegroom to part the bride's hair with a lance. The bird, the fish, and the snake were phallic symbols. In addition, there existed in enormous quantities theriomorphic representations of the sexual instinct, in connection with which the bull, the he-goat, the ram, the boar, and the ass were frequently used. An undercurrent to this choice of symbol was furnished by the sodomitic inclination of humanity, when, in the dream fantasy of modern man, the feared man is replaced by an animal. There is recurring in the ontogenetic re-echo the same thing which was openly represented by the ancients countless times. There were he-goats which pursued nymphs, satyrs with she-goats. In still older times in Egypt there even existed a shrine of a goat god, which the Greeks called Pan, where the Hierodules prostituted themselves with goats. It is well known that this worship has not died out, but continues to live as a special custom in South Italy and Greece. Today we feel for such a thing nothing but the deepest abhorrence, and never would admit it still slumbered in our souls. Nevertheless, just as truly as the idea of the sexual assault is there, so are these things there too, which we should contemplate still more closely, not through moral eyeglasses with horror, but with interest as a natural science, since these things are venerable relics of past culture periods. We have even today a clause in our penal code against sodomy, but that which was once so strong as to give rise to a worship among a highly developed people has probably not wholly disappeared from the human soul during the course of a few generations. We may not forget that since the Symposium of Plato, in which homosexuality faces us on the same level with the so-called normal sexuality, only 80 generations have passed. And what are 80 generations? They shrink to an imperceptible period of time when compared with the space of time which separates us from the Homo neanderthalensis or heidelbergensis. I might call to mind in this connection some choice thoughts of the great historian Guglielmo Ferrero. It is a very common belief that the further man is separated from the present by time, the more does he differ from us in his thoughts and feelings, that the psychology of humanity changes from century to century like fashions of literature. Therefore, no sooner do we find in past history an institution, a custom, a law, or a belief a little different from those with which we are familiar, than we immediately search for some complex meanings, which frequently resolve themselves into phrases of doubtful significance. Indeed, man does not change so quickly. His psychology at bottom remains the same, and even if his culture varies much from one epoch to another, it does not change the functioning of his mind. The fundamental laws of the mind remain the same, at least during the short historical period of which we have knowledge, and all phenomena, even the most strange, must be capable of explanation by those common laws of the mind which we can recognize in ourselves. The psychologist should accept this viewpoint without reservation as peculiarly applicable gospel to himself. Today, indeed, in our civilization, the phallic processions, the Dionysian mysteries of classical Athens, the bare-faced phallic emblems have disappeared from our coins, houses, temples, and streets. So also have the theriomorphic representations of the deity been reduced to small remnants, like the dove of the Holy Ghost, the Lamb of God, and the cock of Peter, adorning our church towers. In the same way, the capture and violation of women have shrunken away to crimes. Yet all of this does not affect the fact that we in childhood go through a period in which the impulses towards these archaic inclinations appear again and again, and that through all our life we possess side by side with a newly recruited, directed, and adaptive thought, a fantastic thought, which corresponds to the thought of the centuries of antiquity and barbarism. Just as our bodies still keep the reminders of old functions and conditions in many old-fashioned organs, so our minds too, which apparently have outgrown those archaic tendencies, nevertheless bear the marks of the evolution passed through, and the very ancient re-echoes, at least dreamily, in fantasies. The symbolism which Freud has discovered is revealed as an expression of a thinking and of an impulse limited to the dream, to wrong conduct, and to derangements of the mind, which form of thinking and impulse at one time ruled as the mightiest influence in past culture epochs. The question of whence comes the inclination and ability which enables the mind to express itself symbolically brings us to the distinction between the two kinds of thinking, the directed and adapted on one hand, and the subjective, fed by our own egotistic wishes, on the other. The latter form of thinking, presupposing that it were not constantly corrected by the adapted thinking, must necessarily produce an overwhelmingly subjectively distorted idea of the world. We regard this state of mind as infantile. It lies in our individual past and in the past of mankind. With this we affirm the important fact that man, in his fantastic thinking, has kept a condensation of the psychic history of his development. An extraordinarily important task, which even today is hardly possible, is to give a systematic description of fantastic thinking. One may, at the most, sketch it. While directed thinking is a phenomenon conscious throughout, the same cannot be asserted of fantastic thinking. Doubtless a great part of it still falls entirely in the realm of the conscious, but at least just as much goes along in half shadows, and generally an undetermined amount in the unconscious, and this can therefore be disclosed only indirectly. By means of fantastic thinking, directed thinking is connected with the oldest foundations of the human mind, which have been for a long time beneath the threshold of the consciousness. The products of this fantastic thinking, arising directly from the consciousness, are, first, waking dreams or day dreams, to which Freud, Flournoy, Pick, and others have given special attention. Then the dreams which offer to the consciousness at first a mysterious exterior, and win meaning only through the indirectly inferred unconscious contents. Lastly, there is a so-called wholly unconscious fantasy system in the split-off complex, which exhibits a pronounced tendency towards the production of a dissociated personality. Our foregoing explanations show wherein the products arising from the unconscious are related to the mythical. From all these signs it may be concluded that the soul possesses in some degree historical strata, the oldest stratum of which would correspond to the unconscious. The result of that must be that an introversion occurring in later life, according to the Freudian teaching, seizes upon regressive infantile reminiscences taken from the individual past. That first points out the way, then with stronger introversion and regression, strong repressions, introversion psychoses, there come to light pronounced traits of an archaic mental kind, which under certain circumstances might go as far as the re-echo of a once manifest archaic mental product. This problem deserves to be more thoroughly discussed. As a concrete example, let us take the history of the pious Abbé Eger, which Anatole France has communicated to us. This priest was a hypercritical man, and much given to fantasies, especially in regard to one question, viz., the fate of Judas, whether he was really damned, as the teaching of the Church asserts, to everlasting punishment, or whether God had pardoned him after all. Egger sided with the intelligent point of view that God, in his all-wisdom, had chosen Judas as an instrument in order to bring about the highest point of the work of redemption by Christ. This necessary instrument, without the help of which the human race would not have been a sharer in salvation, could not possibly be damned by the all-good God. In order to put an end to his doubts, Egger went one night to the church and made supplication for a sign that Judas was saved. Then he felt a heavenly touch upon his shoulder. Following this, Egger told the archbishop of his resolution to go out into the world to preach God's unending mercy. Here we have a richly developed fantasy system before us. It is concerned with the subtle and perpetually undecided question as to whether the legendary figure of Judas is damned or not. The Judas legend is, in itself, mythical material, viz., the malicious betrayal of a hero. I recall Siegfried and Hagen, Balder and Loki. Siegfried and Balder were murdered by a faithless traitor from among their closest associates. This myth is moving and tragic. It is not honorable battle which kills the noble, but evil treachery. It is, too, an occurrence which is historical over and over again. One thinks of Caesar and Brutus. Since the myth of such a deed is very old and still the subject of teaching and repetition, it is the expression of a psychological fact that envy does not allow humanity to sleep, and that all of us carry, in a hidden recess of our heart, a deadly wish towards the hero. This rule can be applied generally to mythical tradition. It does not set forth any account of the old events, but rather acts in such a way that it always reveals a thought common to humanity and once more rejuvenated. Thus, for example, the lives and deeds of the founders of old religions are the purest condensations of typical contemporaneous myths, behind which the individual figure entirely disappears. But why does our pious Abbé torment himself with the old Judas legend? He first went into the world to preach the gospel of mercy, and then after some time he separated from the Catholic Church and became a Swedenborgian. Now we understand his Judas fantasy. He was the Judas who betrayed his Lord. Therefore, first of all, he had to make sure of the divine mercy in order to be Judas in peace. This case throws a light upon the mechanism of the fantasies in general. The known, conscious fantasy may be of mythical or other material. It is not to be taken seriously as such, for it has an indirect meaning. If we take it, however, as important per se, then the thing is not understandable, and makes one despair of the efficiency of the mind. But we saw in the case of Abbé Egger that his doubts and his hopes did not turn upon the historical problem of Judas, but upon his own personality, which wished to win a way to freedom for itself through the solution of the Judas problem. The conscious fantasies tell us of mythical or other material, of undeveloped or no longer recognized wish tendencies in the soul. As is easily to be understood, an innate tendency, an acknowledgment of which one refuses to make, and which one treats as non-existent, can hardly contain a thing that may be in accord with our conscious character. It concerns the tendencies which are considered immoral, and as generally impossible, and the strongest resentment is felt towards bringing them into the consciousness. What would Egger have said had he been told confidentially that he was preparing himself for the Judas role? And what in ourselves do we consider immoral and non-existent, or which we at least wish were non-existent? It is that which in antiquity lay widespread on the surface, viz., sexuality in all its various manifestations. Therefore we need not wonder in the least when we find this as the base of most of our fantasies, even if the fantasies have a different appearance. Because Egger found the damnation of Judas incompatible with God's goodness, he thought about the conflict in that way, that is, the conscious sequence. Along with this is the unconscious sequence, because Egger himself wished to be a Judas. He first made sure of the goodness of God. To Egger, Judas was the symbol of his own unconscious tendency, and he made use of this symbol in order to be able to meditate over his unconscious wish. The direct coming into consciousness of the Judas wish would have been too painful for him. Thus there must be typical myths, which are really the instruments of a folk psychological complex treatment. Jacob Burckhardt seems to have suspected this when he once said that every Greek of the classical era carried in himself a fragment of the Oedipus, just as every German carries a fragment of Faust. The problem which the simple story of the Abbe Egger has brought clearly before us confronts us again when we prepare to examine fantasies which owe their existence this time to an exclusively unconscious work. We are indebted for the material which we will use in the following chapters to the useful publication of an American woman, Miss Frank Miller, who has given to the world some poetical, unconsciously formed fantasies under the title Quelques faits d'imagination créatrice subconsciente. Volume 5, Archives de Psychologie, 1906. End of section 5.